Welcome to the Damascus Road podcast. On the road to Damascus, Paul had a radical encounter with Jesus and his life was changed forever. That is what we hope and pray for here. Now, on to this week's episode.
Direct your attention to the monitor. This is a picture of my beautiful wife, Lacey. Being married during the pandemic means that I have Lacey, my best friend, with me while everyone else has to stay distant, and I am very thankful for her. This next picture is a picture of us getting married, or at least on our wedding day. Any guesses as to how long ago that was? Maybe by picture quality, or I don't know. Unfortunately, she's not here, so you can't see a current version for comparison, so all you have is me. Take a look. You may have noticed how thick and luscious my hair was back then. And by contrast, how the current version has a little Bilbo Baggins to it. It feels thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. But I figured out a trick. If you purposely cut your hair short or shave it, sometimes you look like a guy who chooses to have a shaved head or short hair instead of a guy who is balding. I think it's better. Anyway, how long ago do you think that was? 3 years. My kids probably think 40 years because they think we're really old. That was on July 16th, 2005. So 15 years ago and a little bit. And that picture was taken in Brashear, Missouri, where Lacey grew up. It is a town of about 280 people or so. Quite small. I, on the other hand, grew up in Chicago. Well, suburban Chicago. Much safer but less cool sounding than the city. Either way, it is a much more populated area, and as one would expect, there were some differences in how we grew up. For instance, I knew who lived in, 5 to 7 houses on my street out of about 60. I also knew my address. You know how houses have an address? Lacey, on the other hand, didn't have an address most of her childhood. Apparently, everyone in Lacey's town knew her and knew where she lived. Or if they didn't or forgot, they would ask at the one gas station and would be quickly given directions based on landmarks. I get the impression that random strangers, including kidnappers and murderous lunatics, looking for where Lacey lived would also be given detailed directions to my future wife's residence. And this is one of the biggest differences. Where Lacey grew up, she knew everyone and everyone knew her. And for me, it was different. It wasn't like I grew up in isolation. I knew pretty much everyone at our church, but it just wasn't possible or reasonable to know everyone in Chicago or even in my suburb or my block. And one way this plays out is that I hadn't been to a funeral, at least that I remember, until my grandpa died when I was in college. Lacey, on the other hand, went to the funeral of everyone who died in Brashear, Missouri when she was growing up. And even though I knew almost everyone at our church, I didn't go to the funerals of the people who died, I assume because I was a kid. Whereas Lacey estimates that she went to more than 30 visitations and funerals before she started college. And now here's a way that I think this is translated to our marriage 15 years later. A little while ago, in the evenings after the kids are in bed, aka the most precious time of the day, while we're, in bed on our phones or laptops or watching TV or doing whatever we choose to do with that time, Lacey would start commenting on how sad something was that she was reading about. I would ask her what she was reading, thinking it was probably something on Facebook from a friend. But it turns out she was reading about a little girl who had terminal cancer, which is very sad. I asked who it was, and it turns out it was someone who lived around Brashear that a friend of a friend of a friend posted about on Facebook that she had been following her fight with cancer on the internet. And this is a place where me and my wife would make different decisions. On the one hand, Lacey feels a sort of connection to this person because they grew up in the same area or they know some of the same people. And I think that she's also maybe more comfortable reading about sickness, death, and tragedy than I am. Then there's me. I don't go out of the way to read about cancer patients. I generally am not looking for a tragic, sad story to follow. If it's someone I know and love, I will follow, I will pray, I will give to help with medical expenses. But someone who just lives in a similar place to where I lived 15 years ago, not only would I not choose to spend my evenings following the story, I likely wouldn't have heard about it in the first place. And this is definitely a place where I would draw the line and decide to stay safely removed from this story. And while some of this is based on how I grew up, there's an aspect that is a choice to try to kind of keep people's problems at arm's length. I'm pretty busy with all the things that I have going on with my job, my family. I value my limited free time, and spending it purposely engaging with the pain and suffering of strangers is not high on my list. And this is just a small window into an attitude that I see come through in a lot of places in my life. I think I have a lot going on. I have a demanding job. I have a wife and 3 kids. I have a house and a yard that it turns out takes a whole ton of work. It's really just a lot, but I can handle it. I don't need to ask for a bunch of help. And this attitude harkens back to a phrase that I've heard and I at least associate with small town contexts when describing a trait of someone to be admired. They say that he never asked for nothing from nobody. And you've got to love the shameless embrace of the double negative in that phrase. But grammar aside, this is something that I try to do. I'm uncomfortable asking for help from people. I don't like doing it in stores. I don't particularly like taking my car in for service because there's a lingering feeling for me that I should be fixing my car myself, even though I have no idea how to do so. Even when it's something pretty understandable, like asking a friend to borrow a truck, Stan is having trouble. I start thinking to myself, how much can a used truck cost anyway? Maybe I should just go ahead and buy one so I don't have to ask for help so much. And to kind of underscore how dumb this is, I think the average of how often we have to borrow someone's truck is no more than twice a year. Now, I think I'm a bit on the extreme side with all these examples, and this is one of the topics that I've spoken to where I don't think I'm speaking from a point of having it figured out at all, that I'm writing a message for myself as much as anyone. But I also think that my attitudes here are somewhat common and even pervasive in our culture. For example, what does America say to do if you find yourself in poverty? Do you ask for help? No, we say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is a free market. This is capitalism. Clearly, the only thing standing between you and poverty and turning that into prosperity is some hard work and ingenuity. Another example, in one of the greatest episodes of one of the greatest shows ever, which remember, I got married 15 years ago, Seinfeld. Jerry gets a boyfriend, which is the title of the episode, or what later has come to be known as a bromance with former baseball player Keith Hernandez. And in this episode, the parallel that is drawn to going all the way in such a relationship is being asked to help someone move, or even worse, being asked to drive them to the airport, which I don't think is worse. Just driving to the airport is way less time commitment. What's being said here is these are okay things to ask a friend, but only a really, really, really good friend, and only if you've reached a certain point in that relationship. Another place where we see this is what we think of as the ideal life. Like, what kind of house do we aspire to live in? Generally, it's a big one with a lot of land so that there's plenty of privacy. And maybe if you're lucky, you buy up a few extra lots around that land so no one builds apartments behind your house and obstructs your view of the mountains. This is what's happening with our house right now. Another aspiration in our culture is to be independently wealthy, having enough money that you don't need to depend on anyone else, not your job, not family or friends or neighbors or anyone for help. We want to be self-sufficient, to have everything together, and really to be the envy of the people around us. American culture places a high value on being autonomous, independent, and self-sufficient. And in this series, we're talking through the differences between strong American values like this one and the actual values that we read about in the Bible, the values of God's kingdom. Our goal is to correct misconceptions about American values and biblical values being the same. And there's certainly overlap at times, which is good. But in some ways, there being some overlapping values can cause further confusion about what is right and what Jesus really taught. So to see what the Bible says, I'm going to go to what I think is actually the closest to a biblical endorsement of independence and autonomy that I could find. This is the Apostle Paul writing to one of the churches he visited and founded after moving on to minister elsewhere. He writes, "As apostles of Christ, we certainly had a right to make some demands of you, but instead we were like children among you, or we were like a mother feeding and caring for her own children. Don't you remember, dear brothers and sisters, how hard we worked among you? Night and day we toiled to earn a living so that we would not be a burden to any of you as we preached God's good news to you. And there are some similar passages in Paul's other letters and then further described in the book of Acts that point to Paul's preference not to be a financial burden to the towns and to the churches where he preached about Jesus. He was a tent maker or a leather maker or leather worker, which is what he's referring to with the night and day we toiled to earn a living. And based on a read through these various passages, Paul nearly always says that they have a right to material compensation from these churches, but that they choose to get their money elsewhere. The reason appears to be that he believed that this would help the message that they were preaching be accepted more readily and would help advance the gospel. And this is made fairly clear in this following passage from 2 Corinthians. He writes, "Was I wrong when I humbled myself and honored you by preaching God's good news to you without expecting anything in return? I robbed other churches by accepting their contributions so I could serve you at no cost. And when I was with you and didn't have enough to live on, I did not become a financial burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia brought me all that I needed. I have never been a burden to you, and I never will be." So clearly here, it's not that Paul is unwilling to accept resources from churches. Based on further reading, it sounds like these other churches giving the contributions were probably the church in Philippi, which is Macedonia is in that area, and some others he visited earlier. Paul is okay with accepting help and support for his ministry, but he believes in not being a burden while preaching, at least in Thessalonica and Corinth, which is where these two letters went, and likely in other churches and cities as well. And I think that this means that taking these passages as saying that autonomy and independence are good things and that we shouldn't ask anyone for help, I think that's just a wrong read. And another good question to ask here that helps is, how did Jesus handle this same situation? He had a 3-year ministry. Surely there were expenses. How did that work? Let's read. This is from the Gospel of Luke. It says, "Soon afterward, Jesus began a tour of the nearby towns and villages, preaching and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. He took his 12 disciples with him, along with some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom he cast out 7 demons, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, Susanna, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples." So Jesus' ministry was supported by his followers. Specifically, it sounds like the women who he had cured of diseases and cast out demons, including some key donors whose names are mentioned here in this passage. So Jesus, the Son of God, who more than anyone had the power to be autonomous if he chose, he did, after all, feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He did not choose to be autonomous, but instead accepted help and resources to pay for his ministry. And on a side note, isn't it weird to think of Jesus sitting around having a budget meeting? I think with Judas Iscariot, because I think he carried the purse. Very odd scene. So anyway, looking at these passages, this is not really a value in the Bible. There is the example from Paul on some of the potential benefits of being somewhat self-sufficient. So maybe it could be said that America just goes further than the Bible suggests down this path. So what does that mean? Let's start extrapolating what placing such a high value on autonomy can do to us. And I think a lot of these things, as we go over them, we'll realize that we see these in the American values. All right, first, if it is such a highly valued thing to be autonomous, to not need help from anyone, what does that do to our attitude towards people who need help and who ask for help? What do we think about people who need food stamps to get by, who need to ask their relatives or friends for money to get through a rough patch? When we are proud of our own self-sufficiency, what do we think of people who are working hard but can't scrape up enough to afford health insurance, or who work minimum wage jobs and depend on the state to be able to make ends meet? Our high value on autonomy, on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, means that we often think of these people as lazy. We think of them as drains on society, as people who are worse than us, who do not deserve the help that they get and don't deserve our sympathy. Our valuing autonomy makes us callous to the needs of those around us. In Paul's example of being self-sufficient, it was so that he could better serve others, so that there would be fewer obstacles to the advancement of the gospel. Oftentimes in the American version of the value of autonomy, the result is less empathy for people in need. Being annoyed that someone is asking for help, kind of a, aren't we all supposed to be handling our own problems sort of mentality? Some evidence of this in America, just to show that this does go on. There was a recent poll about the upcoming election. The poll asked evangelicals, I don't think that's the greatest term these days, but in short description, Bible-believing Protestants is a pretty good summary of what that's supposed to mean. The poll asked people who they hope their vote benefits in this election, and here are the results. And this was shared with me on the Relevant podcast, which I think I mention them in almost every message I get. All right, here's the results. It says 41% of people said nationwide that they're voting for people nationwide who are like me. 20% they hope their vote helps me and my family. 15% people our country has failed. 9% people nationwide who are different from me. 8% people in my community, and 7% we're not sure. So if you add up the two biggest categories there, which are essentially saying I'm voting for people like me, for my family, 61% of people primarily hope that their vote benefits themselves. Now, you could argue this may be the point of our democracy, that if everyone is voting for themselves, we end up with the result that benefits the majority of people. Again, though, that democracy is part of American culture, another way that we are pushed to look out for ourselves and not for others. And just remember that this, in theory, is a subset of the American people that are devoted Christians. 61% are saying that they're voting primarily for themselves. Another good example of this comes from the book that kind of inspired this series for us, called The Myth of the American Dream by D.L. Mayfield. And to set the stage for this quote and story, the author lives in an apartment complex in a poor area of Portland. Marianne, the other character in this, is from Afghanistan and is newly moved to the United States. And for context, the author here is way, way, way better on the whole, not trying to be autonomous thing than me, or at least on loving her neighbors. At one point in the book, she talks about driving by rundown apartment buildings and how she wants to move into all of them to get to know the people who live there. Which, similar to my wife reading the stories of relative strangers going through cancer, is something I don't really understand. All right, here's the story. All right, and this is the author essentially talking here. So she said, several years into our friendship now, Marianne treats me like a younger sister. Recently, she noticed the new-to-us car my husband had purchased, a tiny little shiny vehicle with good gas mileage and a cheap price tag. My husband was so proud of this car, a sign of frugality, but Marianne saw it differently. She had multiple children and no driver's license. Going to the grocery store for her was an immense undertaking. Ever since she left her home country, she had been denied the simple pleasure of grocery shopping, of touching the food with her own hands. Now her husband got together with the other men and shopped once a week, using the long list she wrote as a guide for what the family would eat. Marianne took one look at our little car and said, "What, did you not think of us when you bought this car?" My heart sank within me, desperate to explain myself. Our decision to purchase something that was cheap and reliable and that suited our small family's needs. Marianne shook her head. "For someone with a big heart," she said, "you sure do like small cars." We laughed together, but her honesty was a gift that cut several ways. She was pointing out that we come from different cultures with different values. My first impulse is usually to take care of myself first. I do not view Marianne's troubles as my own, as my responsibility in the way that families care for one another. I think the husband in this story sounds like a stand-up guy. And by that, I mean that's the sort of decision that I would have made and been quite proud of. Is there anyone else, and this probably just reflects badly on me, who reads and listens to that and has the reaction that it's kind of rude for Marianne to presume that DL should think about her needs when buying a car? That's one of my reactions, even when I know I'm reading something to try to pull myself away from the American value of autonomy. I still read that, and I'm somewhat hurt for the author because I feel like she is so much better than me in these ways. She is doing so much to try to love her neighbors. And I just it hurts me to see her called out like that. But nonetheless, I think this almost underscores it, that it clearly shows how deep that value of autonomy is in Americans, and how different that is from what Marianne knows from Afghanistan, which I think is probably more representative of a lot of the countries in the world. Our high value for independence and autonomy means that we don't save much thought for the need of others. Our sympathy for them goes down. Our love for our neighbors goes down. And needs that we could have helped fulfill for other people go unmet. And this is an issue on which the Bible is very clear. It doesn't take a read through somewhat obscure passages about how different ministries are funded. I'll read two passages here, both from Jesus. First one from Matthew. It says, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." So, second great commandment, love your neighbors. The next one, Megan covered this some last week. It comes under the heading in my Bible, the final judgment. It talks about how Jesus will separate the righteous or the sheep from the wicked, which are called the goats. And I'm truncating this because it's actually very long. It says, "Then the king will say to those on the right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me.' Then the king will turn to those on the left and say, 'Away with you, cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his demons. For I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me a drink. I was a stranger and you didn't invite me into your home. I was naked and you didn't give me clothing. I was sick and in prison and you didn't visit me.' Then they will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and not help you?' And he will answer, 'I tell you the truth, when you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you are refusing to help me.' And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life." Now, I think an argument can be made that trying to be a person who doesn't need a lot of help from other people can be at least somewhat good or not a terrible thing. But this is where the real danger comes in. When we pump up that value to where we do not love and help our neighbors, thinking things like, shouldn't they be able to take care of themselves? Or, I never asked them for help. Why do they have to ask me? Now we are violating arguably the biggest values and teachings in the Bible, to love your neighbor. When Jesus is asked, what are the greatest commandments? One of them is love your neighbors. And when Jesus is talking about how he will separate the righteous from the wicked, it's not who has prayed the most or put their faith in him. It is who fed, clothed, and cared for the least of these. And this is where our American value of autonomy really begins to directly clash with the values of God's kingdom. Our overblown American value of autonomy can put us in direct opposition with the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. But what about the first one? The first one being, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. One of the things that I realized as I was writing this message and contemplating my own overly independent, introverted, autonomous ways is that when we so very much value doing things ourselves and not needing anyone, it can seep into how we view and interact with God. If I am trying so hard not to need other people, do I lump God in with those other people? Am I also trying to get to a point where I don't need God? Now, for me, one of the places where I do this is when I'm at work, and at in quotation marks because I'm usually in my bedroom at my desk these days. I realize that this is a time where I feel like I just need to take care of this work thing, which, for context, takes up like half of my time, and another huge chunk is sleeping. That this is something that I can take care of, that I don't need to bother God with it, and coincidentally, probably not coincidentally, this is the stuff and the source that is the source of biggest stress and anxiety in my life. And for some reason, I'm usually blind to this being a problem. And it's not like I'm a totally different person at work or that I treat people poorly or anything like that, but I just don't pay much attention to God during that time. It's like I think that I'm freeing God up to help other people who need him more than I do, because this is something that I can handle. Now, I've also been very slowly reading The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. I'm in chapter 1. I won't say when I bought it, but what I've read is very good. So last week I was reading it, and I came upon this passage. And for context, it's talking about how we all have kingdoms, defined as things where we have control over. Kind of the realm where you can kind of make what you want to happen. And that God's design for us is that we rule these kingdoms with him, such that his will is done in the things that we have control over. And this story is an example of how that worked for one man. Frank Laubach wrote of how, in his personal experiment of moment-by-moment submission to the will of God, the fine texture of his work and life experience was transformed. In January of 1930, he began to cultivate the habit of turning his mind to Christ for 1 second out of every minute. After only 4 weeks, he reported, "I feel simply carried along each hour, doing my part in a plan which is far beyond myself. This sense of cooperation with God in little things is what so astonishes me, for I'd never have felt it this way before. I need something and turn round to find it waiting for me. I must work to be sure, but there is God working along with me." And when I read this passage, which was very impactful on me, it made me realize again that I was trying to be independent even from God sometimes. And the result was a fairly high amount of stress and anxiety. Now, I also had, two conflicting reactions to this. One is that it sounds like exactly what I need, that this rings so very true to me that going with God through my life is the right way to live, and that it is the answer to a major source of stress in my life. And the second one is 1 second every minute? How in the world does that work? So the real answer to this second question is that I haven't really figured it out, which is probably an excuse. But what I have tried is being more conscious of bringing God with me throughout my day. And it has certainly helped. Now, I do think that the brilliance of the 1 second every minute thing is that since reading this passage, the amount I've been intentional about being with God throughout my day has gone down. And I think this is kind of what happens with us humans, and why something like turning our minds to God once every minute, while sounding quite extreme, may be the exact sort of thing that we need. And this dependence on God is another area that I think is very clear in the Bible. Maybe it can be argued that it's, that you trying to do some things yourself may be okay, but it's very clear that we are to be dependent on God. When he had been fasting for 40 days and is tempted in the desert, Jesus says the following. He says, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." And then similarly in Paul's writings, he says, "I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength." We are meant to live with God, dependent on him. We are also meant to live our lives with others in community. The wealth and prosperity available to a lot of Americans has enabled us to take this value of independence and autonomy to new levels. Who has ever borrowed a cup of sugar from a neighbor? This used to be a thing, but now getting sugar from the store takes maybe 10 minutes, and it's not very expensive. My example of feeling like I should just buy a used truck because I need one twice a year was ridiculous. but I could probably spend a few $1,000s on a truck. It wouldn't be wise, but I could do it. This isn't how we're supposed to live, though. In the Bible, we read, this is in Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return on their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And then in a letter from Peter about the early church, it says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. And those are just a couple of passages that say this. There are a whole lot of verses about how we are to love each other, share what we have with each other, make sure that there are no needy among us. This is very clearly a value of God's kingdom, to love one another. It's a value that people will love each other, that they will help each other out, and that they will live together. Not isolated in big mansions or estates, not in communities where we pretend our neighbors don't exist, but in community with one another. So how do we do this? Obviously, we are doing church remote right now due to COVID. Many of us would love to live more in community, but we also don't want to contribute to the winter surge in the pandemic. These are good questions. One of the verses that I looked at on community from Hebrews said, don't give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, which is, a little bit of a funny verse in our current context. So one thing I would say is whatever the version of meeting together we have, which is the live stream, small groups, Discord chats, the gatherings on campus, don't give up meeting in those ways. I know we would all like to do lunch after church at restaurants like we used to do, or meet in person. And maybe there are ways that this could be done, maybe with takeout at people's homes or in smaller groups or something like that. But independent of that, we need to continue to meet together in ways that we can. Don't give up on them because they're hard or you have Zoom fatigue, which I almost always have at the end of a workday. And we often mention the DR Shares database. If you have something you can share with others, post it on there. And the other piece of that, which I haven't seen as much of, if you have something that you need, post that. I'm not great at remembering things that we have, but if someone specifically says they need something, we might have it. I recently learned that there's such a thing as pack rat traps, and I have those. I have no idea how they work or if they work, but apparently we have some. And this next one I really think is the biggest thing for me. Ask someone for help. We need to cultivate the gift of receiving, not just of giving. Our culture kind of pushes us more toward being on the giving side, but is also good for our souls to receive. Graciously accept praise or a compliment. Accept someone's offer to buy you a meal or a cup of coffee. Come and pick up a box of food from the food bank instead of just handing them out. Or go on DR Shares and ask for something you need. But Brad, I don't need help, you may say. I know, you're awesome and independent, but it is not good for us to go through life that way. It has consequences for our hearts, making us less loving and less dependent on God. Break the cycle. Think about what you could ask someone to do to help you out. It may be big, it may be small, but asking for help is a practice that helps foster humility, community, and love with the people around us. And then also on the other side of this, help someone out who asks. Or even better, ask if there's a way that you can help a friend. I know one of my biggest hurdles to asking for help is assuming that people don't really want to help or that it'll be an inconvenience to them. Let someone know that you are able to and willing to help them out. Let them know that you care and that you want to know their problems so that you can help them get through. And then last application point, let God be with you as you go through these difficult times. If you want to try focusing on Jesus for 1 second out of every minute, go for it. The main obstacle I've seen to this is getting the reminder mechanism correct. My first thought was the clock on my phone, but the timers have to be shut off. And then, 1 second becomes like 10 seconds every minute, which seems like a lot. So I'm thinking that I'm looking for an app that would just make my phone vibrate once every 60 seconds. It's probably not hard, but I didn't figure it out. If someone does, send me a message. I want to try this. No promises that I won't scale it back to once every 3 to 5 minutes, but all of those options would be a huge improvement over now. And then to close, remember that we are citizens of God's kingdom first. The kingdom that values loving one another, living in community, and loving God with all your heart. That's the one we're a part of. This nation and culture that pushes us to be autonomous, to think about ourselves first, and to look down on people who need help is not God's kingdom. We can love and cherish our nation. We can pray for our leaders and work to improve it, but we must not let it ride over the values that Jesus taught us to be right and true. The values of loving God, loving others, and living in community. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you. I thank you that you want to be with us, God, that you're right here with us and we need only to focus on you, God. I thank you that you built us to live with other people, to love one another, and to grow together, Lord. I thank you that you're here with us as we gather, even as we gather remotely, Lord. Lord, we love you. I pray for all of our community and for our country, Lord, as there's a lot of division. I pray for unity, especially unity among the church, God. We love you, Lord. Pray for these things in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you for joining the Damascus Road podcast. Our mission is to follow Jesus together by being with God, loving everyone, transforming people, developing leaders, growing new ministries, and changing the world. You can find out more about us online at DamascusRoadTucson.com.